Awareness itself is a teacher. Alama Prabhu, the greatest mystic philosopher, says, Vandembene Eradagide, Eradembene Vandagide, Guru Shishyaremba Bhavakke Bheda Unte. The meaning of that particular statement is, even when I describe it as one, it becomes two. And if I say two, it is already one. And how can I differentiate between a guru and a shishya? That is the question Alama Prabhu asks. Alama Prabhu is a 12th century philosopher and mystic, a contemporary of Basavanna. So, Arivu is the inner principle. When it dawns inside, the difference between the guru and shishya vanishes. The word guru is a relative term. That means only when one has a student, he can be called a teacher. Similarly, only when one has a teacher, he can be called a student. Therefore, a student is also a relative term. Guru Shishyara Sambandhavanariyalu Hodre Tane Guruvada, Tane Shishyanada, Tane Lingavada. That is another Vachana in the Vachana tradition. As long as ignorance or Marevu is there, so long there won't be Linga Sakshatkara. To put it differently, once a person achieves Linga Sakshatkara, then he bids goodbye to ignorance. So that is the Eastern philosophy, telling us about Guru Shishya Sambandha or Guru Pupil teacher relationship, teacher pupil relationship. This is the relationship between the teacher and the student in the Eastern world. Now, our important task is to turn our attention to the Western world, because most of you are familiar with the teacher-student relationship in the Eastern world. But now, I think the urgent need is to know the teacher-student relationship in the Western world. So to begin with, 5th century BC. That is the period we are considering for our purpose today. Then I move on to the present. At that time, the professional higher educators in the Western world were a group of brilliant talkers and keen thinkers. They were called sophists or the professional wise men. Sophists were called the professional wise men. Since they were professional talkers, they used to sell their intelligence, and this also led them astray. The moment you start selling your intelligence, your integrity becomes a bit loose, so to say. Same thing happened in the case of the sophists. Sophists were the contemporaries of Socrates. After Socrates, the intellectuals called themselves philosophers. What is the meaning of the term philosophers? As you all know, philosophers means lovers of wisdom for its own sake. Lovers of wisdom for its own sake. Many things these sophists discussed 2,500 years ago, we are still discussing. Please note, many things that these sophists discussed through 2,500 years ago, we are still discussing. For example, point number 1. Are there any absolute standards of morality or merely artificial conventions? Are there any absolute standards of morality or merely artificial conventions? This is question number 1, which we are still tackling. We are still seeking answers. And this question was raised by the sophists 2,500 years ago. Question number 2. Is justice constant, or It dances to the tune of the ruling class. How relevant, how current this second question particularly is. I repeat, is justice constant or it dances to the tune of the ruling class? So these are the two questions the sophists asked 2,500 years ago, and we are still asking this question, and we have not found the answers, proper answers for these questions. The sophists were brilliant as thinkers, but as teachers, they were very superficial. They may be wonderful thinkers, but a teacher is defined in a very different way. As teachers, they were very superficial. Basically, the sophists were lecturers. They were phenomenally graceful and subtle talkers, usually to fairly large audiences. They were capable of talking about any issue under the sun. They possessed an extraordinary intelligence that you give them any topic, they would, talk about it very freely and extensively, elaborately. So they were very capable of talking about any subject under the sun. In their capacity, they resemble our own modern day journalists. For example, our modern day journalists to talk about anything and everything without resorting to too many technical words or terminologies or what we call jargons. Without resorting to jargons, our modern day journalists are capable of talking about any subject under the sun. This we have been noticing. But it is also true that the sophists' constructive to build sophists' method was not constructive to build a civilization. Now, what is the touchstone, the measurement, the yardstick to understand the greatness of a philosopher or a thinker, or how to understand the sophists? The sophists' method was not constructive to build a civilization. That was the lacuna. But still, they reminded the Greeks about one thing. Sophists reminded the Greeks about one particular thing, and that is thought alone is one of the strongest forces in human life. I repeat, thought alone is one of the strongest forces in human life. The respect for the thinker, which they created, has lasted off and on until this very day. Now, today we talk of thinkers. Thinkers are respected in almost all societies because they possess a certain kind of samadarshitva. They are able to think about the pros and cons. Very rational human beings. They will always have the goodness of heart, and they think of the goodness of the society at large. Therefore, the sophists said, thought alone is one of the strongest forces in human life. And the respect for the thinker, which they created, has lasted off and on until this very day. Some of the contemporaries of Socrates thought that he resembled the sophists. But whenever he got an opportunity, Socrates said, don't compare me to the sophists. I am not a sophist. Please don't compare me to the sophists, he said categorically. The sophists went around the world, Greek world, but Socrates never stirred out of Athens. You all know about the great city called Athens. That was the center of all transaction, philosophical, mundane, everything. Athens was the center. And Socrates stayed at this particular place, as we say, staying at one dear perpetual place. Any philosopher worth his salt will stay in one particular place, and Socrates did that. He stayed in Athens, never stirred out of the city, and whereas the sophists went round the Greek world, propagating their ideas and philosophy, whatever their belief was. So the sophists delivered speeches carefully prepared. Socrates simply put questions. So there is a radical difference between the methodology adopted by the sophists and Socrates. Sophists delivered speeches carefully prepared, whereas Socrates simply put questions. They used to charge exorbitant fees for their lectures. This is the difference between the sophists and Socrates. Sophists charged for their lectures exorbitant fees to their lectures, but Socrates hated to charge anything. He never received any remuneration or money, cash or kind, for his teaching. Okay, but Socrates hated to charge anything. He lived a poor man and he died a poor man. The sophists dressed well, received attention from the servants, and advertised well before their speech or lecture. Socrates' dress was very, very simple. You might have seen in pictures, etc., in books. Socrates' dress was very, very simple. He didn't even wear sandals. He was a barefoot philosopher. He hailed from a family of sculptors. In a sense, he was from the artisan community. They delivered their lectures in definite halls and venues. But he used to engage people in conversation in street corners. That is the basic difference between the methodology adopted by Socrates and the methodology adopted by the sophists. They always wanted a particular hall, particular venue where they went in all their regalia and then delivered lectures systematically. Whereas Socrates stood in street corners and then put questions and to elicit answers from the people themselves. So Socrates said, I train people to think. That was his belief. I train people to think. Notice further difference between Socrates and the sophists. The sophists said, we know everything. We are ready to explain. That is their stand. We know everything and we are ready to explain. As a contrast, look at Socrates' approach. He said, I don't know anything. I am trying to understand. I don't know anything. I am trying to understand, he said. Sophists were the first lecturers. Socrates was the first tutor. The innovations Socrates made were to use ordinary conversation as a method of teaching and to act on one's society instead of detaching himself and traveling. This is the fundamental difference between the sophists and Socrates. Sophists went around the Greek world. They announced in advance about their lectures, about they selected the venue, the place, etc., etc. But Socrates, always believed in acting on one society only, that is the society of Athens, his own society of Athens, instead of detaching himself and traveling. Socrates was not a brilliant conversationalist. As you all know, a conversationalist will always provide an opportunity to other person to engage in a dialogue. Because in that sense, Socrates was not a brilliant conversationalist. He would make the other person speak more. He only put questions. That was his method. He simply put questions and elicited answers from the people. So what are the kinds of people that approached Socrates? In fact, an entire spectrum of people visited Socrates and put questions and answered for the questions very well. Capitalists approached him, conservatives, extremists, friends, enemies, critics, famous people, ordinary people, prostitutes, politicians, artists, soldiers, common Athenians, all the renowned people who visited Athens approached him. So there is no bar. Only he never selected people. He said, welcome, all of you are welcome. Whoever wants to, seek clarification, clear one's doubts, you are most welcome, he said. And therefore, I read out the list just now, what kind of people approached Socrates. And Socrates really elicited answers from them by putting relevant questions. So that we are made to think whether it is easy to put questions, formulate questions to various categories of people I listed just now. It is a very, very tough task. For example, how can you prepare questions to various kinds of people? One can more easily deliver lectures. That is easier than putting questions to various types of people. The more prominent among, in fact, Socrates was a great teacher because he had such great students. Who are the prominent students he had? One very prominent student, of course, as you all know, Plato. Plato started a college called Academy to teach systematically what had been taught by his guru, Socrates. Now, he had observed from the close quarters Socrates' method, the method adopted by his guru, his teacher, Socrates. Therefore, he wanted to be different from his teacher, and hence he opened an institute called Academy. The word academy is still being used by us even after the lapse of 2,500 years. So Plato wrote many books regarding philosophy, and all of them are in the form of dialogue. Whatever Plato wrote, we simply call it, categorize it as dialogue. And Socrates is at the center. This is the greatest tribute a student could pay to his teacher, making the teacher the center, placing the teacher at the center of the whole transaction. That was the way in which Plato paid tribute to his guru. So at the dialogue, at the center, the entire dialogue is woven, placing Socrates at the center. In the books that Plato wrote, the conversations of Socrates have been recorded quite systematically. One wonders whether Socrates did really, deliver his speeches so systematically in an orderly fashion. Whatever it is, Plato, employing his intelligence and brilliance, has made Socrates answer in a systematic way. We wonder whether Socrates could have thought about things so systematically. But it is true that for Plato's thinking, Socrates' thoughts have provided the matter. Plato thought that it is impossible to teach everyone. Now, this is the difference between Socrates' thinking and Plato's thinking. Socrates welcomed each and everyone, and he taught standing at the street corners, whereas Plato, right from the beginning, believed very firmly that it is impossible to teach everyone, and therefore limited his efforts to highly trained, carefully chosen listeners. He was the first one to introduce the examination system. Socrates could never have thought of this examination system. Immediately after Socrates, Plato comes and he introduces the examination system and declares that we can't teach everyone. It is impossible to teach everyone. Therefore, he selected and chose certain individuals as students. Now, from Plato, we move on to Aristotle, his student, Plato's student. Aristotle was the genius student produced by Plato. How can we define Aristotle? Because he is considered to be the originator of all possible knowledge under the sun. He possessed such a capacious mind. And how do we define him? One of the definitions given by an educationist as far as Aristotle is concerned is as follows. Probably the best and broadest single mind the human species has yet produced. Probably How do we define Aristotle? He is defined like this. Probably the best and broadest single mind the human species has yet produced. A wonderful definition, in fact. Plato had learned from his master, Socrates, that there is no possible way to educate people, to convert them and change them and convince them fully and lastingly. This is Plato, who had learned the lesson from his master Socrates, that how to convert people into our own belief, convince them fully and lastingly, except by calm, cool reasoning. Ask questions. That is the only way to convince people. Ask questions. You don't plunge into fight when you discuss issues with someone. I'm going back to Plato and then coming back, I will come back to Aristotle in a second. Plato said, you don't plunge into fight when you discuss issues with someone. Now, we are living in a democratic country, democratic world, and here is a master, Plato, talking about the democratic way of discussing things 2,500 years ago. Therefore, how are we going to resolve issues? Plato gives the answer. He says, two quarreling parties, discussing about the validity of a particular issue. He says, you both join helping each other to detect and capture the truth you both desire. I repeat again, you both join helping each other to capture truth you both desire. How to settle the dispute between two parties, two quarreling parties? Since both of them claim to be seeking truth, both of them have to sit together and think calmly and capture the truth both of them are desiring. This is the advice given by Plato 2,500 years ago, and we are not following this dictum. We are not following the words of wisdom given by Plato. Now, coming back to Aristotle, he was a rich doctor's son and always preferred the scientific habit of thought. He joined Plato's academy at the age of 17 years, and he remained there till he was almost 40. That means he received training for 23 years. He joined Plato's academy at the age of 17 and he remained there till he attained the age of 40. For 23 long years, he received training. Only after the death of Plato, he left the academy, and subsequently, Aristotle started his own institution and called his institution Lyceum. That means a literary institution. Lyceum means literary institution. So Aristotle thought that teaching and research are the two sides of the same coin. Now, I think we are really surprised to find this particular observation coming from, so early from Aristotle. He said, teaching and research are these two sides of the same coin. Now, in the 21st century, some of our teachers say, I don't have the bent of mind to do research. I am only a teacher and I can teach excellently. I'm a great teacher. I'm a good teacher. Students love my teaching, etc., etc. There ends the matter. I do not have any aptitude to do research, they say. But remember, Aristotle said long back, teaching and research go hand in hand. They are the two sides of the same coin. So therefore, we shall not resist. All of us, to an extent possible, should undertake research. Once we start teaching, we also should undertake research because, as Aristotle said, teaching and research go hand in hand. Much of Aristotle's teaching was the sort of very high-level discussion which goes on in similar institutions today, wherever they exist. It is a in high-level institutions today, for example, institution of IAS, Institution of Science, IITs, etc., high-level discussion take place. And similar was the case in Aristotle's institution. Aristotle understood that one of the toughest jobs in teaching is to train leaders of men. Now, please remember, it is absolutely impossible to teach, train leaders of men. His assignment was to teach Alexander the Great. Aristotle became the teacher of Alexander the Great. Aristotle taught Alexander to love and respect Greek culture. Like charity begins at home, we must understand our culture very well. Therefore, Aristotle, taught Alexander Greek culture. He began with Homer, great 18th century BC. Homer belongs to 8th century BC. And Achilles, the Greek hero of Homer's epic Iliad, was Alexander's favorite. People believed that Achilles was Alexander's ancestor. Alexander always kept with him a copy of the epic given by his teacher. It is said that Alexander bemoaned the absence of a poet who would sing about his heroism as effectively as Homer sang about Achilles. That's why he says to sing about the heroism of my ancestor Achilles. Great poet Homer was there. But now I am a hero. To talk about my heroism, there is no one. He bemoans. So that is Alexander's anecdote. It is said that Alexander bemoaned the absence of a great poet, and because in the contemporary world, Alexander's time, there is no equivalent poet who can sing my exploits and my heroism. So Aristotle could not have taught democratic values to Alexander, but he taught him the virtue most important in a monarch. He could not have taught democratic values because, as you all know, what did Alexander become? He became a great, dictator. He became a great dictator, so to say, monarch. Everyone should be under his thumb. That was the rule. So therefore, he taught him at least one virtue which should be possessed by all monarch, and that virtue is generosity, which Aristotle himself called generosity is greatness of soul. At least that he taught Alexander. Generosity is greatness of soul. Now, as I said at the beginning, it is not possible for me to go through all the centuries in a systematic manner to talk about the teacher-pupil relationship in the Western world after dealing with these three ancient world Greek philosophers and teachers, namely Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. I take a big jump and come to Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, his pupil always stayed with him. They listened to him and watched him and tried to understand and imitate him. Any number of students, pupils that gathered around Jesus Christ, they stayed with him and they tried to understand him and they tried to emulate or imitate him. If he wanted, Jesus could have chosen the rich students. In the ancient world, there was no dearth of rich students. If he really wanted to have rich students, certainly Jesus Christ could have such rich students. But instead, he chose the common people, the poor people, the misguided ones. I call the last category as the misguided ones because in the world, the number of misguided people is always great. You may have some intelligent people, you may have some rationally thinking people, but the majority of the human population consists of the misguided people. Therefore, he deliberately chose the poor, the common people, and the misguided people. More often, Jesus Christ delivered short speeches in the open air. He did not confine himself to a particular hall or an auditorium as it exists in the ancient world. He came to the open air and delivered his speeches to a huge crowd. Huge crowds gathered to hear him. They would remain with him for quite a long period, hoping that he would open his mouth and tell them something, utter some words, because Jesus Christ would not use the language incessantly. He is not that type of a teacher who would talk incessantly like what I am doing right now. I cannot stop, because the moment I stop, you would think that my matter is dried and the teacher is going to stop now. Now, Jesus Christ waited for his words. He spoke sporadically, sparsely, and the pupils were so devoted and dedicated to Jesus Christ, they waited for his words, but he would remain silent for long. Blessed are the humble in heart, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the humble in heart, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. After uttering these words, Jesus Christ would become silent, and he would speak again after the lapse of some minutes. Who mourn, for they will be comforted. I repeat, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Like this, Jesus Christ spoke as if they were the formula, they were the suktis, they were the aphorisms. Those who heard him firsthand possibly have remembered what he actually said. Because these words came as some kind of sukti, some kind of divine utterance, they stuck to the minds of the listeners. Blessed are the humble in heart, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. All these words stuck up in their memory. So the reconstruction of the manner in which Jesus spoke suggests that Jesus composed his sayings in the form which would make them most memorable. So while we are dwelling on Jesus, we need to refer to the fact that why does a good teacher have bad pupils? This is not a strange phenomenon. All of you have observed during the course of your teaching career. Why does a good teacher have bad pupils? Jesus had 12 pupils, and one was Judas Iscariot. Among the 12 apostles or pupils, one was Judas Iscariot. He betrayed his teacher Judas and handed him over to his enemies. So Judas betrayed Jesus Christ and handed his own teacher to the enemies. What had Jesus taught his pupil? Why did he give his own teacher to the enemies? What had he taught? What was the substance that Jesus Christ did teach? He said, all men should love and trust one another. This was Jesus Christ's quintessential philosophy, so to say. All men should love and trust one another. Obviously, Judas Iscariot understood Jesus, because if he had his teacher, he would have certainly put this statement into practice. All men should love and trust one another. He betrayed his own teacher. So even Socrates had a bad pupil called Alcibiades. Socrates had Plato as his pupil, you know that, but Plato's classmate was called Alcibiades, and he was a bad person. And then we have very many individuals in the ancient world who can be described as bad students. We have all heard of the proverb, when Rome was burning, Nero was fiddling. Are you familiar with that proverb? I think you're all familiar with that proverb. When Rome was burning, Nero was fiddling. Such a man was there in Rome, Nero, and he was Seneca's student. Just like Plato was Socrates' student, Seneca had a student called Nero. Seneca was a great writer, orator, philosopher, and a playwright. He had given Nero, his student, a thorough grounding in moral philosophy. Okay, just like Aristotle had trained Alexander the Great in certain philosophies. Seneca also trained Nero as far as moral philosophy was concerned, and a considerable knowledge of literature and art was also injected to him. But what happened to Nero, who had received moral philosophy at the hands of Seneca, the great teacher of the ancient Rome? Moral decline started at the age of 22. Nero's moral decline started at the age of 22. What did he do with these individuals? The immediate circle, for example, Nero retired his tutor Seneca. He sent him home. Next, he divorced and executed his wife. Next, either he executed or murdered his own mother. And lastly, he executed his teacher, Seneca, also. The important problem is why really talented people with the best of teaching should turn out fatally, damnably bad, like Nero, like Judas. Why does this happen time and again in the world? Alcibiades, for example, destroyed all that Socrates admired. Now, there are certain ethical qualities, moral philosophies that Socrates admired. And his own student, Alcibiades, Plato's classmate, destroyed all that Socrates believed. For example, Socrates believed in integrity, purity, and patriotism. All these are valued philosophies, beliefs as far as Socrates was concerned. But this man, Alcibiades, never believed in integrity, purity, and patriotism. So it is not easy to find an answer to our question. Our question is, why really talented people with the best of teaching should turn out fatally, damnably bad? In spite of having great teachers, why certain individuals become bad students? That is our question, and there is no convincing answer for that. For example, when Judas was asked, why did he do that? Why did you betray Jesus Christ, your own teacher? Why did you hand him over to the enemies? What was his answer? Judas's answer? He simply said, I don't know. I don't know. Yes, I betrayed my teacher, but don't ask me any further question because I don't know why I did it. Plato says any student could follow the path of destruction. Probably he had Alcibiades, his classmate, in his mind. Any student could follow the path of destruction. When a young man or woman so richly endowed goes wrong, he or she goes very far wrong. They deliberately attack their teachers, trying to annihilate them and all they stand for. So now from Jesus Christ to the medieval times, I take a big leap of nearly 500 years. Now I come to the Middle Age. The new group of great teachers appeared in the schoolmasters of the Renaissance, not the Middle Age, but the Renaissance period, which begins from 1450 AD, middle of the 20th previous millennium. So a new group of great teachers emerged in the Western world somewhere during the Renaissance period, 1450 AD. They believed in the civilizing powers of education. Rabelais, Montaigne, and others, they believed in the civilizing powers of education. Again and again, The men of the Renaissance praise their schoolmasters. Now, look at the way they describe their own teachers, schoolmasters, not the professors in the university, but ordinary schoolmasters. These students had wonderful adjectives to describe their schoolmasters. For example, some people were described as possessing universal minds. Some teachers were described as eloquent as Cicero, the great Roman orator. Our teachers are as eloquent as teachers, they said. Our teachers possessed the universal minds, they said. And in the eyes of these students, their teachers were fountains and treasure houses of knowledge. Our teachers are fountains and treasure houses of knowledge, they said. So they praise the completeness and versatility of their teachers. They would have said that a teacher who knows only biology or only French is not fit to teach at all, is not fit to teach at all. The pupils of the most famous teachers of the Renaissance have spoken about them with sincere enthusiasm, admiration, and love as benefactors of humanity and as personal friends. The teachers simultaneously are the benefactors of humanity and also personal friends. This is how the students have described their teachers with enthusiasm, admiration, and love. These are the three things that they remember as far as to describe their teachers: enthusiasm, admiration, and love. In the 19th century, again, I am taking a big leap from the Renaissance period to the modern times. In the 19th century, there were several revolutions in education, as we all know, because the introduction of universal education was one such revolution. So there are so many revolutions down the ages, but one such revolution in the 19th century was the introduction of universal education. In the modern world, it is only since about 1870, please notice the watershed year, 1870, 1870. It is only since 1870 that the majority of the citizens of civilized countries have been able to read and write. Before 1870, most of the people in the world did not know how to read and write. Our ancestors were all illiterate. They were all illiterate. Only after 1870, in the 19th century, I think majority of the civilized world began to learn reading and writing. But most of the world's population is still illiterate, as you know. Universal education also resulted in bad teaching. That also we should take into account. Universal education also resulted in bad teaching because you needed thousands and thousands of teachers in one go. Therefore, run-of-the-mill teachers increased in numbers. Ordinary, mediocre teachers' number also swelled correspondingly because we needed them in large numbers. Therefore, the run-of-the-mill teachers also increased. Bad teachers rapidly multiplied and almost wrecked several important subjects by teaching them repulsively. Even if you are given a good subject, if someone is a bad teacher, he will ruin that subject by teaching in a bad fashion. Therefore, teaching repulsively. Good teachers were fewer than we should expect. Still, the 19th and early 20th centuries did produce a number of great teachers whom their pupils remembered with gratitude and honor. Remember, earlier pupils or students described their teachers with admiration, with love, with awe, etc., etc. Now also, in the changed scenario in the 19th and 20th century, because there were some extraordinary teachers, their pupils remembered them with gratitude and honor. Another important quality these great teachers possessed What is the great quality those extraordinary teachers possessed? It gave them that power over their pupils, which extended to all kinds of young men and women from different countries and classes, and which continued to work long after they were dead, even after the death of these teachers, after the lapse of so many years and decades after the death of such teachers, their students remembered them with gratitude and honor. That is the kind of power the teachers exercised over their students. It's difficult to describe that power. What is the nature of that power? Why the students are remembering such teachers and praising them so high? It is very difficult to describe. Indeed, many people, after feeling it, have complained of being unable to describe it. If you ask the students, they will say, we do not know how to give expression to our feeling. Such is the reverence we have towards our teacher, we can't describe it in words, they say. It is still more difficult to acquire that power a teacher possesses. It cannot be taught at teachers' colleges, not always developed by meditation and practice. Yet, it is invaluable for a successful teacher. It is the core of a successful man or woman. What is that extraordinary quality which is possessed by these extraordinary teachers? Roughly speaking, we can call that power as largeness of heart. We can call that power possessed by the teachers as largeness of heart. The quality which we call largeness of heart also involves two things. That is energy. It possesses energy. Largeness of heart means energy. Energy in two ways. One is physical energy, another one is psychical energy. An extraordinary teacher possesses both physical energy as well as psychical energy. These great teachers do not flag, flutter, miss on one cylinder. They do not flag, flutter, and miss on one cylinder. Means their level of energy, their energy level will not come down what may. They maintain the same grade of energy, and then it does not flag, which does not get reduced. Where do they get this power, this energy? The answer is they draw on underground reservoirs of vigor. Just like we have underground reservoirs, these extraordinary teachers possess the underground reservoirs of vigor, energy, vitality. Sometimes these energies are startlingly physical, startlingly physical. You can actually touch it and feel it. That's the kind of energy teachers possesses. Again, I will go back to the example of Jesus Christ. In fact, this people used to crowd around him trying to touch him. When Jesus Christ delivered his speeches, addressed large gatherings, so people always wanted to touch him, which means they thought that if they could tap the current flowing through him, they would get new strength. That is the belief of the listeners. If they touched, they would also get that current, that vitality. They can absorb at least some portion of that energy, they thought. Therefore, they tried to touch him. In fact, he himself felt the same thing, because once when a sick woman touched his clothes, without his knowing, she was cured. And he at once noticed that he had lost some energy. Therefore, I said the extraordinary vitality, vigor possessed by the teachers is startlingly physical. Jesus Christ actually felt when a sick woman touched the edge of his robe, Jesus felt that some of his energy has gone, and that woman got cured of her disease. So it is a strange thing, the energy of great teachers. It does not seem to be purely physical, or mainly physical in origin. Another point about this energy is that it does not seem to flourish or even to exist. If you allow these teachers to withdraw to their secluded abode, when they are sitting in their room or in their compartment alone, without being surrounded by his disciples, they do not seem to possess that energy. What happens to that energy? That when its possessors are alone, meditating, writing in prison or journeys, they don't seem to have that energy. It rises to its full force and seems to renew itself and refresh itself as if it were powered by Niagara Falls. The energy which lies dormant comes to the fore with full force and appears to be a Niagara Falls when its possessor is surrounded by a number of other people. Not a random crowd, as in a railway station, but by people who are being taught by him, receiving something from him. The great teacher always requires an attentive crowd, not a random crowd that we find in a railway station or a bus station or on the street, etc. But, when hundreds of people with rapt attention listen to a teacher, then the teacher derives that energy. So until then, that energy is invisible, it lies dormant. But the moment the willingly listening crowd surrounds him, that energy comes to the fore with full force. So some of those who command it say that its strength depends largely not on themselves, but on others, the men and women around, the listeners, the watchers, the pupils. It is the men and women who are surrounding him, the watchers, the listeners, and the pupils. It is they who give me energy, and it does not lie within myself, they say. The research scholar can feed himself, but the teacher has to nourish many others. If we are talking of a single research scholar, he reads books, he refers journals, he makes notes and prepares his thesis, and his energy is just sufficient for him to take care of his individual needs, requirements. But we are talking of a teacher. A teacher has to nourish and nurture the intellectual capability of so many students. Therefore, he has to draw his strength from various sources. That is the moral philosophy. So he must draw his vigor from many other different sources. Now, when we are talking of teachers, well, there are two types of teachers. One, cold and dry, first type. Second type of teachers are warm and rich. You have observed both these types. For example, you yourself may belong to either this category or that category. You may be cold and dry while you are delivering your lecture in the classroom, or you may belong to the second category, namely, your lectures may be warm and rich. Now, as far as the first category, cold and dry, is concerned, there was a historian, a French historian, who said, for 25 years, not one eloquent phrase has ever passed my lips. For 25 years, I have been teaching, not even once I have used a showy, rhetorical language. So that automatically, makes him a professor whose lectures are cold and dry. Some people, always make it a point to speak according to the requirement of the classroom and the subject. They never digress from the given subject. They deliver it in a cold and dry fashion. So that's the reason why I invoked the name, the example of this French historian. But on the contrary, there is the great physicist, the English physicist Rutherford, Rutherford used simple and direct English, combining clarity and power. Such teachers are also there, combining clarity and power using simple and direct language. Now, pupils sometimes distrust teachers who are never baffled. They like now and then to see a tutor puzzling over a problem, a lecturer groping for words. Sometimes students like those teachers who scratch their head, try to remember certain words, certain phrases, and certain individuals, certain epoch, history, etc., etc. They like them because they think that he is quite human. He or she is quite human. Sometimes we have to fumble for words. Turn the tap and water flows. That is not the phenomenon of lecturing, because sometimes you may not get the required word in the context. Therefore, you think over, you stop for a while, and students in the classroom situation like such a teacher because, after all, he is human and then he is not a sarvagna, they will say. So, the second type of lecturer is warmer. The eloquent lecturer adds other powers. The teachers belonging to the first category may deliver their lectures which are cold and dry. They may not use rhetoric, showy language for its own sake to draw the attention in a dramatic fashion. But the second category of teachers use other powers. For example, varied and attractive delivery, graceful and memorable phrases they use, striking illustrations they give, a personal relationship with the audience they strike. They strike a personal relationship with the audience. They give examples and then they use graceful and memorable phrases, and then they make their deliveries very, very attractive. This is second category of teachers, warm and rich. Now, I immediately remember the example of T.H. Huxley, the biologist, the English biologist Huxley. He followed this method of varying his delivery, employing memorable and graceful phrases, and then giving examples, attractive examples, and also striking a personal relationship with the audience. All these techniques T.H. Huxley employed, and he was a great teacher. Huxley's closest parallel in America was a person called Louis Agassiz. He was from Switzerland. He taught in American universities. A small little fellow. ಒಂದು 5 ಅಡಿ ಇರ್ಬೋದು, 5 ಅಡಿ 2 ಅಂಗ್ಲನೋ ಏನು, so short. He was almost a dwarf kind of a professor, but extraordinary teacher. Louis Agassiz, extraordinarily teach. People love to call him Little Swiss. Switzerland in ಬಂದವನಾದ್ದರಿಂದ people used to call him Little Swiss. He founded the teaching of both zoology and geology at Harvard. As you all know, Harvard is one of the great universities in America, and it was this Louis Agassiz who started teaching zoology, science, and geology at the same time. Okay, and throughout the United States, his lectures were very, very famous. And Agassiz loved teaching. This is the lesson we need to draw. Unless we love teaching, we cannot delight the audience. So if you are bored, if you think that teaching is too much, you want a respite from this job, then it is extraordinarily difficult. Therefore, this little Swiss Agassiz loved teaching, and he would teach anyone and everyone. Now, I must give you at least 10 minutes for question and answer, because I have to stop at 1 o'clock as the clock is ticking. Therefore, I will cut short. I will not be able to say anything about this little Swiss who was an extraordinary teacher. And now, towards the end of my talk, I will make one reference to my own teacher in the University of Mysore, English teacher, because as we are dealing with teacher-pupil relationship, it is better to give one concrete example of my own teacher, Professor C.D. Narasimhaya, who was English teacher extraordinary, introduced very many subjects to Indian universities in the English syllabus, and he talks about his own teachers, particularly J.C. Rollo and F.R. Lewis. F.R. Lewis, Professor F.R. Lewis was a great critic and teacher in Cambridge, in England, and Professor CDN went to England and became his student, F.R. Lewis. And of course, in Mysore Maharaja's College, when CDN was the student, he had Professor J.C. Rollo as the principal and English teacher. And J.C. Rollo lived in Mysore, taught Indian students before independence. Of course, all the principals of Mysore Maharaja's College were English people, Britishers. And Professor J.C. Rollo was also an Englishman. And Professor CDN, in his autobiography, has recorded a particular incident about his own teacher, J.C. Rollo. And this is the quotation. This university professor of English and principal of the university's only arts college in the state of Mysore corrected with meticulous care 200 compositions every term, made helpful marginal comments, and did all he could to let us see our mistakes while he met us in small groups, a method and a commitment which no one else I know or care to cultivate. So this Professor J.C. Rollo took home 200 compositions made by the students and corrected them, corrected their grammar, their sentence, their syntax, and their method of composition. This is how we learned English, Professor CDN says, and that is great J.C. Rollo. So that is about it. You know, this is the great service rendered by the English professors during those days. Now, while closing my talk, I think at least you should get 5 or 10 minutes for question and answer. I will narrate one particular incident and then stop. It pertains to the great physicist, Nobel laureate, Sir C.V. Raman. Sir C.V. Raman received a letter from the Rashtrapati Bhavan at that time, from the President of India. I think it was Dr. Rajendra Prasad who sent a letter. Sir C.V. Raman received a letter from the Rashtrapati Bhavan stating that on such and such a day, you are going to be honored with Bharat Ratna. You will be our guest. Kindly receive the honor and accept our invitation. That is the gist of the letter received by Sir C.V. Raman, letter from Rashtrapati Bhavan. And immediately Sir C.V. Raman wrote the reply. Kindly pardon me, forgive me, I will not be able to attend this honor function, felicitation function. But however, I thank you. At this particular moment, I am guiding my student who is about to submit his PhD thesis. So since both of us have reached the end of the thesis, I will not be able to stir out of my place. Kindly forgive me. I have to be with my PhD student as he is about to submit his thesis. This is the letter, and he sent it across. And this particular anecdote is an eye-opener for all of us. Even if you are awarded Bharat Ratna, this great teacher, suddenly will not keep everything aside and run to Rashtrapati Bhavan to receive Bharat Ratna. He may have received it later on. That is a separate matter altogether. But look at the commitment of this great teacher. I cannot come right now because one of my students is submitting his PhD thesis. I have to be with him. This is the most crucial, critical moment as far as his academic career is concerned. He wrote, and then that is the lesson we have to draw. It is a message for all of us. Therefore, this is the ultimate relationship a teacher and student has. So the Western world, the Eastern world, both of them in a way have a similar commitment towards each other. Teacher and students have us. Like this, I can go on enumerating very many anecdotes and bring about the fact that the teacher-student relationship is always the honorable one for the betterment of the society, for the betterment of the individuals concerned. Ultimately, we receive education and knowledge not in order for to achieve individual success of our own selves, but learning and education that we receive ultimately has the aim of bringing the betterment and well-being of the larger society and the larger world. Therefore, I think this teacher-pupil relationship must be very, very strong, honorable, with full of integrity and meaning. I think with this, I close. I don't know whether we have sufficient